Chapter 6, The Ethics of Activity, Die Sache Selbst. Before we do so, however, we must attempt to disengage and formulate something that must be called a Hegelian ethic. It is one of the centers of gravity of Hegel's philosophical thinking. They are multiple, and is certainly susceptible to systematization in the form of a codified and ultimately metaphysical system. Indeed, such provisional centers account for the way in which Hegel can be drawn in a number of incompatible ideological directions, this one left-wing and loosely Marxian, others, such as the alleged conservatism of his commitment to immanence, in some more right-wing direction. In fact, there are probably more possible Hegels available for ideologization than these two political opposites, but what needs to be reaffirmed at this point is the illicit nature of any such systematization, which amounts to the transformation of Hegel's thinking and his texts into that other thing called Hegelianism, a systematic philosophy and a metaphysics in whose construction he himself, particularly in the Berlin works, had no little complicity, but which as an ideology can be separated from the energy of his thought itself and the dialectic. Much the same operations can indeed be observed in the fortunes of Marx, whose writings Engels generalized into what has come to be called Marxism, a systematic philosophy which has several possible forms, an ideology with which one can certainly have some sympathy and even commitment, as I do, without seeking to conceal its radical distinction from what I prefer to call theory, or even theoretical writing, which makes no such systematic or philosophical claims. Still, the Hegelian ethic I now wish to present is best grasped in the form of a kind of philosophy, if not the philosophy of praxis exactly, then at least the philosophy of production, the philosophy of Gewinntätigkeit, or activity, of work, of externalization. Übrigens ist mir als verhasst, was mit Schloss belehrt, Unmeintätigkeit zu vermehren oder unmittelbar zu bleiben, Goethe to Schiller, the 19th of December, 1798. It does not make its appearance in the Phenomenology until the celebrated master/slave chapter, a tardiness which itself casts an interesting light back on the emergent scientific theorization of force that preceded it, and that finds its fullest development in the more static pursuits of observing reason that follow. For the upshot of the struggle between master and slave to be is not at all the fulfillment of desire. The latter is a good deal easier to deal with, as Hegel shows in a passage which vindicates Brecht's judgment of him as a great comic writer. With this appeal to universal experience we may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. In this respect we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom, viz. the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus, and that they have still to learn the secret meaning of the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. For he who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part he brings about the nothingness of such things himself in his dealings with them, and in part he sets them reduce themselves to nothingness. Even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom but, on the contrary, show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it, for they do not just stand idly in front of sensuous things as if these possessed intrinsic being, but, despairing of their reality, and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to without ceremony and eat them up. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things. 65. Be diese Berufung auf die Allgemeine kann es erlaubt sein, die Rücksicht auf das Praktische zu antizipieren. In dieser Rücksicht kann den Genigen, like Jean Warrington geschieht der Realität der sinnlichen Gegenstände behaupten, gesagt wurden, dass sie in die älteste School der Weisheit, namentlich in die alten Eleusinian Mysterien der Ceres und des Bacchus zugewiesen sein und das Geheimnis des Essens des Brots und des Trinkens des Weins erst zu lernen haben, denn in dies Geheimnis im Juheit gelang nicht nur zum Zweifeln die sein der sinnlichen Ding, sondern sie verbeflang. An einem Wohlbringen einen Teil selbst Ironitigkeit, Teils sie Hüter sie Wohlbringen. Auch steht hier seid nicht von dieser Weisheit ausgeschlossen, sondern erweisen sich weil mir, am Öfsten in sie im Juheit zu sein, denn sie bleiben nicht vor den sinnlichen Dingen als in sich seienden stehen, sondern bei Felden dieser Realität und in der Wohlgen Juifiheit Ironitigkeit landen sie mit ihr suchen sie auf, und die ganz Nature feiert wie sie diese Fenbaren Mysterien, like es lehren, was die Wahrheit der sinnlichen Ding ist. 91. The desire evoked in the self-consciousness chapter is a good deal more complicated than this one, and does not admit of any immediate physical satisfaction. Hegel seems to have cast an earlier version of this dialectic in sexual terms as a gender opposition 25, and only later to have repositioned the sexual dialectic in the later chapters on pleasure and necessity, the law of the heart and virtue, and to have recast this one in the very different spirit of a desire for recognition. A conceptual innovation which has resonated down to the present day. It is clear that the thematics of recognition as such will have fundamental consequences for any politics, and that it will be more congenial for the politics of race, gender, and ethnicity than for class struggle. 26 But this is not our topic for the moment, which has rather to do with the consequences of this recognition for the body and for production and consumption. The structure of this, the most famous chapter in the Phenomenology, is well known and has given rise to innumerable interpretative traditions. It was Alexandre Kojev whose commentary on the so-called struggle between the master and the slave, Herr and Knecht, more literally, the lord and the serf or bondsman, placed this episode on the phenomenological as well as the political agenda. This is surely the first time in the history of philosophy in which the problem of the other is thematized as such. Reflections on solipsism and Descartes' musings about automata are by this decisive intervention at once transformed into dead ends and false problems. One line of filiation leads directly, without passing through Heidegger's notion of the mid-same or being with others, thereby itself revealed as yet another dead end, to Sartre's doctrine of the look, which posits all individual relations as irresolvable conflict. The transformation of these individual confrontations with the other into collective ones will then open this initial problem up to the theoretical innovations of the critique of dialectical reason. Meanwhile, Hegel's own thematization of the problem, along with its inevitable containment and reduction by way of the notion of intersubjectivity, will give rise to a second, dare one say bourgeois, philosophical and political tradition. Here the tradition of political tolerance and class or multicultural harmony denounced by Sartre becomes a political strategy of recognition, most notably theorized by Axel Honneth and, in a different way, by Jacques Rancière. We will evaluate these political prolongations later on when we return to Kojev. Yet the dialectical subtlety of Hegel's phenomenological analysis deserves its acknowledgement here. In a sense the struggle for mastery constitutes an externalization of the unhappy consciousness, where the latter posited an inward location in which my own self or consciousness, positioned as inessential, as contingent and worthless, as unjustified to use a later Sartrean language, confronts the absent yet essential and central transcendence it has itself posited. The master/slave struggle then exteriorizes both poles of this dialectical confrontation, whose outcome alone will determine to which side the qualifications of essential and inessential are to be applied. Or rather, it would be more accurate to say that self-consciousness is only achieved by way of such externalization, and that the individual achievement of self-consciousness or reflexivity is itself dependent on some prior eruption of the other into my field of experience. More significant than the external status and property categories are then these dialectical ones of essentiality and centrality, in terms of which the accession of the one anonymous consciousness to feudal lordship and domination is expressed, while the surrender of the other to what is his subaltern status of and la lettre will condemn him to serfdom or slavery, depending on the social paradigm in which we articulate this myth, so qualified because it is neither an historical event nor any permanent structure of human relationships. The stakes of this life and death struggle are not, however, for Hegel, the will to domination and the drive for social power, but rather the necessity of recognition by the other which Hegel attributes to the emergence of self-consciousness, and whose Sartrean version testifies that it need not be grasped in any edifying and pedagogical or developmental fashion. As for the outcome, this brings us back to life and the body in a different way. For the master to be achieves his victory through his disdain for life, or perhaps we should say his indifference to his own death. Recognition for him is the stubborn fidelity to honor, as one finds it in its various cultural avatars in aristocracies from medieval Europe to feudal Japan. The future slave, however, is committed to life and to the life of his own body under whatever conditions, preferring to submit rather than to die in the service of abstract value. This would seem to place the master in a more positive or philosophical light as some Hegelian or Platonic idealist, while the slave, the Breachian coward, is a materialist in his fear of physical death. Yet Hegel's discussion here takes a strikingly existential and even Heideggerian turn, as he celebrates the death anxiety and the capitulation of the loser to the absolute master, death. Here, indeed, angst foreshadows what will later on be identified intellectually as absolute skepticism and then politically as absolute freedom, the terror in the French Revolution, that is to say, as the supreme power and exercise of the negative that breaks up and dissolves everything substantial in its path, everything subsisting in the status quo of ontic being as such, denn als, was Entstedt, Istwort, das es Zugrunde Fausti, and the source for the coming to be of individual things is that into which destruction, too, happens, for they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. Anaximander, it therefore becomes less clear that it is the master, who, rising above the body and its satisfactions, holds the place of wisdom. Here, rather, the value of negativity trumps idealism and constitutes a philosophically more satisfactory force of the dissolution of the physical, and of everything else, than the master's ignorant samurai-like fearlessness. This reversal is however already at the very heart of the dialectic of recognition itself, for each party gets what he deserves, and the victory of the master is rewarded by his recognition as the very embodiment of the truly human by that subhuman loser who has become his slave. The truth of the master is accordingly the servile consciousness of the bondsman. Just as lordship showed that its essential nature is the reverse of what it wants to be, so too servitude in its consummation will really turn into the opposite of what it immediately is. As a consciousness forced back into itself, it will withdraw into itself and be transformed into a truly independent consciousness. 152/117. The exchange is however an asymmetrical one, and it is not quite accurate to say that the master is thereby the truth of the slave, for the master has become a mere drone, for whom the slave labors and whom he provides with the luxuries and necessities of life. The master's aristocratic status consisting in his own professional duty, namely from time to time to wager his life in armed struggles of whatever kind. The slave's truth is thereby labor itself. His fearful preservation of the body and the physical has become a condemnation to perpetual labor on matter itself. At which point the negative is itself clarified, and this determinate negation of matter, which produces specific works and physical objects, is sharply distinguished from the absolute negation which produces only death and destruction. It is at this point that we greet the first of Hegel's great celebrations of work. Through work, however, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the lot of the bondsman, since in that relation the thing retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object and thereby its unalloyed feeling of self. But that is the reason why this satisfaction is itself only a fleeting one, for it lacks the sight of objectivity and permanence. Work, on the other hand, is desire held in check, fleetingness staved off. In other words, work shapes the thing. The negative relation to the object becomes its form and something permanent, because it is precisely for the worker that the object has independence. This negative middle term or the formative activity is at the same time the individuality or pure being for self of consciousness which now, in the work outside of it, acquires an element of permanence. It is in this way, therefore, that consciousness, qua worker, comes to see in the independent being, of the object, its own independence. 118. Dirk die Arbeit kommt es über sich selbst. In dem Moment, welch der Begierde im Bewusstsein des Herrn entsprit, stehen dem dienenden Bewusstseins wo die Sitte anwesend like ein Bezeichnung auf das Ding gefallen zu sein, in dem das Ding darin sein Selbstständigkeit beholt. Die Begierde hat sich das reine Niedieren des Gegenstandes und dadurch das Anwärmist Selbstgefall wo behalten. Dies Befriedigung ist aber deswegen selbst nur ein Verschwinden, denn es vereiert die Gegenstand gleich sit oder das Bestehen. Die Arbeit hingegen ist gehemmt Begierde, oft haltens verschwinden, oder sie baldet. Die negative Bezeichnung auf den Gegenstand wird zur Form desselben zu einem bleibenden, weil die arbeitenden Gegenstand Selbstständigkeit hat. Dies negative Methode das Formieren die Tan ist sogleich die Einzelheit oder das reine Physik des Bewusstseins, welches nun in der Arbeit auf es in das Element des Bleibens tritt. Das arbeitende Bewusstsein kommt also higher durch der Ansporung des Selbstständigseins als seiner selbst. 153/154. Delayed gratification is certainly a notion familiar to us at least since Weber's Protestant ethic, where, in the form of wages, it characterizes the cultural revolution specific to capitalism, the reorganization of the psyche required for the transformation of peasants into paid laborers. The new temporality Hegel has in mind here would seem rather to reflect the rhythms of handicraft production, insofar as the artisan is still able to recognize himself in the thing produced, in the matter thereby formed. It is an impression that will be corroborated when we come to the full dress celebration of work to be found in the great central chapter on the actualization of rational self-consciousness through its own activity, Die Verwirklichung des vernünftigen Selbstbewusstseins durch sich selbst, section VB, followed up by that devoted to the ironically named human zoology or the so-called spiritual animal kingdom, Das geistige Tierreich, section VCA, and its conceptual centerpiece. The untranslatable Sache Selbst. What is Die Sache Selbst? If you have to ask, then you may never know. I like to quote in this respect the most Hegelian moment in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, in which the humanistic narrator asks his young friend Leverkan, about to embark on a musical career, whether he knows of any feeling stronger than love. J. replies Adrian coolly, Das Interesse. Interest indeed is in that sense the moment in which our productive being is virtually at one with that segment of the world immediately before it, in a kind of humble material enactment of the loftiest philosophical image of absolute spirit and the latter's hypothetical union between subject and object, spirit and nature. But absolute spirit is deliberately characterized as the climax of philosophy's third or speculative dimension. The other two are, depending on how you organize the work, Verstand and Vernunft, understanding and reason, or individual consciousness and spirit, or even, following the logic, being and essence. Die Sache Selbst, however, whether you translate it as the matter at hand or the main issue, the point or the heart of the matter, is not a speculative possibility but a daily experience of what it might be better not to call the loss of self in activity, but rather its externalization. For this is, if anywhere, the moment in which some properly Hegelian ethic offers its most plausible chance to metaphysical and philosophical systematization. What can usefully block this temptation, however, is that complication of a single line of thematic opposition by the counterpoint of another one or even of several distinct binaries. Thus here the alternation of externalization and exteriorization, a moment at the very end of the phenomenology to be projected out, as erinnerung, remembrance, into a whole injunction to include history, is to be sure a familiar and even an inevitable one, but at this first moment of individuality, in Deleuze's language, subjectification, it is rhythmically combined with the tension between the particular and the universal, whose movement Hegel perhaps overhastily dramatizes as a sacrifice. 265. 213. A characterization he will immediately correct by adding that what is thereby sacrificed, the need which the individual has as a natural creature, Naturwesen, are in fact not frustrated, but enjoy an actual existence. 265. 213. The German, Wirklichkeit haben, is stronger than this English rendering, which only the emphasis on the Hegelian art term actuality can properly convey. For it is the universal dimension of the process which alone turns particularity into individuality in the first place. The question then arises as to the nature and origin of this particular universality, which is clearly not that of language discussed earlier. What can translate the mindless individual effort of the body, as for example in the unloading of sacks of grain or the laborious opening of veins of coal in a mine shaft, the harvesting of potatoes or the nailing together of the planks of ship or house, into universality? Here Hegel's simultaneous play of multiple oppositions may well seem prematurely to anticipate each other, and to stumble over their own rhythms. We have already hinted, and will explain later on in greater detail, that spirit for Hegel, the eponymous Geist of this book, always means the collectivity, including custom as such, the sitten of that word Sittlichkeit which is in Hegel to be translated as ethical substance rather than mere individual morality. Indeed the recognition and resultant self-consciousness that already frames this chapter is already here characterized as a begriff or notion that includes the ethical realm within itself. 265. 212. It should then come as no surprise, but it does, that the discussion then suddenly celebrates the nation, the life of a free people, the power of the entire people, as that will form the climax of Goethe's Faust II some 25 years later, presumably as an alternative to the nationalist movement as well as to the Holy Alliance, in other words as a German appropriation of the republican spirit of the French Revolution. But how this political presupposition of the universal is to be understood we will not clearly grasp until the later discussion of the spiritual animal kingdom. For the French Revolution was not only an immense political overturning, the end of the feudal system on the night of August 4, 1789, the displacement of a whole aristocratic elite and of the monarchy itself by the masses of the common people, it was also the climax of a process of secularization as such. This process is not merely to be characterized as the coming of wage labor, although it was also that, but also as the liberation of human activity from the shackles of the sacred, the so-called carrière ouverte or talents, not just the possibility of rising beyond the traditional caste barriers of the old regime, but the plebeianization of that old religious conception of vocation as such or calling, the chance now to follow one's interests and to practice whatever activity speaks to our individual subjectivities, a new freedom from the inherited materia of one's fathers and from the customary assignments of clan or village. But this is now a peculiar enigma or mystery. How is it that I should be tempted by woodworking rather than by the forging of metals? And is my destiny as a weaver or a cobbler, the first political intellectuals, somehow inscribed in my being and the being of things and materials? Now the question is no longer comment putonita personti but why one would wish to become a dentist or a cooper. The question no sooner poses itself than it is once again obscured and occulted by the forces of chance, money and family history, but Hegel continues to pose it with well-nigh ontological force, as his answer, the concept of the spiritual animal kingdom, testifies. For it is as though, like the species of natural beings, socialized humanity were also divided up into the innumerable species of the traits and the handicrafts, according to those Gaben und Fähigkeiten, gifts and capacities, whose notion emerges at this self-same historical moment, and of which only that of genius tenaciously survives today, an idea which can theorized as a force of nature still persisting within us. After a brief existential interlude, in which this newfound individuality explores its enjoyment of self in sexuality, the love passion and the dialectic of virtue and mundanity, the references here are clearly Rousseau, Molière's Le Misanthrope, and the general 18th century preoccupation with virtue from Richardson to Chardet and Robespierre. The concept of work returns, enlarged, as the very concept of action itself. The modern political theorization of praxis awaits Count Sieskowski's essay of 1839, which is, I think, in Hegel primarily grasped as a form of Dichkeit, that creative and productive activity which Goethe tirelessly practiced and celebrated. Nor should it be expected that the pausing of the dialectic interrogation on this form would leave it intact as some kind of natural unity. In Hegel, on the contrary, the act or action also dialectically divides itself into end, means, and result or object, and threatens to leave us with the disillusionment of intentions on the one hand and the sorriest unintended consequences on the other, if not the inability to begin in the first place, inasmuch as the work can never realize those initial dreams we may have had of it, leaving us either in the paralysis of indecision or the mechanical rote work of repetition without ambition. Such a stalemate is however always desirable in Hegel, for it calls forth all the energies of what we may now call his worldview. Accordingly, an individual cannot know what he, really, is until he has made himself a reality through action. However, this seems to imply that he cannot determine the end of his action until he has carried it out, but at the same time, since he is a conscious individual, he must have the action in front of him beforehand as entirely his own, i.e. as an end. The individual who is going to act seems, therefore, to find himself in a circle in which each moment already presupposes the other, and thus he seems unable to find the beginning, because he only gets to know his original nature, which must be his end, from the deed, while, in order to act, he must have that end beforehand. But for that very reason he has to start immediately, and, whatever the circumstances, without further scruples about beginning, means, or end, proceed to action, for his essence and intrinsic nature is beginning, means, and end, all in one. As beginning, this nature is present in the circumstances of the action, and the interest which the individual finds in something is the answer already given to the question, whether he should act, and what should be done in a given case. For what seems to be a given reality is in itself his own original nature, which has merely the illusory appearance of an objective being, an appearance implied in the notion of action with its twofold aspect, but which shows itself to be his own original nature by the interest he takes in it. Similarly, the how or the means is determined in and for itself. Talent is likewise nothing else but the determinate, original individuality considered as an inner means, or as a transition from end to an achieved reality. But the actual means and the real transition are the unity of talent with the nature of the matter in hand, present in that interest. Talent represents in the means the side of action, interest the side of content, both are individuality itself, as an interfusion of being and action. What we have, therefore, is a set of given circumstances which are in themselves the individual's own original nature, next, the interest which treats them as its own or as its end, and finally, the union of these, and the abolition of the antithesis in the means. 240. Das Individuum kann daher nicht wissen, was es ist, es sich durch das Tanze wirklich gebracht hat dort. Es skint aber hier mit den Zweckseins Tanz nicht bestimmen zu können, es getan hat, aber sogleich mu wie es, in dem es beübt sein ist, die Handlung vorher als die Ansehnung DHLs Zweck vor sich haben. Das ENS Handanger die Individuum skint sich also in einem Kreis zu befinden, worin jetzt Moment das andere schon voraussetzt, und hier mit keinen Anfang finden zu können, weil es sein Ursprung like is wissen, das sein Zweck sein mu wie, erst aus dort hat kennenlernt, aber, am Zutan, woher den Zweck haben mu pound. Ich bin darum aber hat es unmittelbar anzufangen und, ante welchen Amstanden es sehr, unwittiges bedenken am Anfang Mittel und in diese Tätigkeit zu schreiten, denn sein Wissen und an sich sein die Nature ist als in einem, Anfang, Mittel und Ende. Als Anfang ist sie in den Amstanden des Handels vorhanden, und das Interesse, welches das Individuum in etwas findet, ist die schon gegeben Antwort auf die Frage, und was hier zutan ist. Denn was ein vorgefunden Wirklichkeit zu sein skint, ist in sich sein Ursprung like Nature, welch nur den Skin eins Seins hat, einen Skin, der in die Begriff des sich entzweienden Tans liegt, aber als sein Ursprung like Nature sich in die Interesse wie das Essen ihr findet, ausbricht dort, ebenso ist das wie oder die Mittel und für sich bestimmt. Das Talent ist gleichfalls nichts anderes als die bestimmte Ursprung like Individualität betrachtet als in das Mittel oder Übergang des Zwecks zur Wirklichkeit. Das wirkliche Mittel aber und der real Übergang ist die Einheit des Talents und der im Interesse vorhandenen Nature der Sache, gen stellt dem Mittel diesit des Tans, dieses des Inhalts vor, beid sein die Individualität selbst, als der Stringung des Seins und des Tans. 297. This outburst is accompanied by a truly Sartrean repudiation of exaltation, lamentation, or repentance, 297/240, without any attempt to disguise the alienation of the act into the antithesis of willing and achieving, between end and means, and again, between this inner nature in its entirety and reality itself, an antithesis which in general includes within it the contingency of its action. The unity and necessity of the act, overlaps the former, and the experience of the contingency of the action is itself only a contingent experience. On the contrary, the antithesis and the negativity manifested in work affect not merely the content of the work or the content of consciousness as well, but affect the reality as such, and hence affect the antithesis present in that reality, and present only in virtue of it, and the vanishing of the work. In this way, then, consciousness is reflected out of its perishable work into itself, and preserves its notion and its certainty as what objectively exists and endures in fact of the contingency of action. 302-304/246. This exaltation of the thing itself is explained by the becoming conscious of this unity of its own actuality with the objective being of the world, since this unity means happiness. The individual is sent out into the world by his own spirit to seek his happiness. 268-215. The individual, therefore, knowing that in his actual world he can find nothing else but its unity with himself, or only the certainty of himself in the truth of that world, can experience only joy in himself. 299-300/242. But we will not fully appreciate the emotion of such passages, which also dramatize that Hegelian notion of satisfaction or fulfillment so dear to Gurdjieff, without returning for a moment to contrast them with the more purely intellectual delight which Hegel attributes to abstract reason's observation of the infinite variety of the natural world itself. While at first it is only dimly aware of its presence in the actual world, or only knows quite simply that this world is its own, it strides forward in this belief to a general appropriation of its own assured possessions, and plants the symbol of its sovereignty on every height and in every depth. But this superficial, mine is not its ultimate interest. The joy of this general appropriation finds still in its possessions the alien other which abstract reason does not contain within itself. Reason is dimly aware of itself as a profounder essence than the pure I is, and must demand that difference, that being, in its manifold variety, become its very own, that it behold itself as the actual world and find itself present as an outer shape and thing. But even if reason digs into the very entrails of things and opens every vein in them so that it may gush forth to meet itself, it will not attain this joy. It must have completed itself inwardly before it can experience the consummation of itself. 146. Zwist sich in der Wirklichkeit nur an in der Sinne als das erreicht überhaupt wissend, schreitet sie in diesem Sinne allgemeinen Besitz nemang des Eiversicherten Eigentums und pflanzt auf Erhöhen und in Eltufen das sich in ihre Souveränität. Aber dieses oberflächlich meines nicht Teil letztes Interesse, die Freud diese allgemeinen Besitznehmung findet in ihrem Eigentum not das fremde andere, das die abstrakt Vernunft nicht in ihr selbst hat. Die Vernunft an sich als ein zu wissen, denn das reine Ich ist und müde fordern, dafür der Unterschied, das mannigfaltige Sein, als das Sein Ich selbst wird, dafür es sich als die Wirklichkeit anschauung sich als Gestalt und Dinge was ich finde. Aber wenn die Vernunft im der Ding der Welt und einen Eltern öffnet, dafür sie sich daraus intelligenz bringen mag, so wird sie nicht zu diesem Bereich gelangen, sondern mühe in ihr selbst vorher sich wollendet haben, an ihrer Wollengange zu können. 186. The scientist's observation of nature, a collector's delight, Rousseau's passion for botany and for the classification of natural species, all those great typologies Foucault attributed to the sciences of the classical age. These passions harbor a secret frustration, a hidden desperation, as observing reason, thrusting its hands into the very insides of nature and churning about within them, or double, is unable in this superficial activity to find itself. Yet we have not yet touched on what completes and seals, finalizes and confirms that dimension of work or action which can alone certify them as being somehow universal. It is a tricky question, which the example of the universality of language will not particularly help us solve in any simple way. Still, the notion of a work as a message or a communication of some kind inflects our thinking about the production of objects or the performing of an act in an unexpected direction, in which objects presumably ask for some kind of consumption while acts themselves, particularly when they are world historical, achieve a very special kind of recognition from other people. This is at any rate the turn that HPS thought takes here, in a shift from the recognition of self that becomes available to me when I externalize myself, to the attention and interest of other people. Actualization is a display of what is one's own in the element of universality, whereby it becomes, and should become, the affair of everyone. 309, 251. This emphasis on the universality of what is truly individual is quite the opposite of that stereotype of the individual versus society which has become a knee-jerk reflex in the Western tradition, and which Hegel explicitly calls a deception here. Betrug. It is, then, equally a deception of oneself and of others if it is pretended that what one is concerned with is the matter in hand alone. A consciousness that opens up a subject matter soon learns that others hurry along like flies to freshly poured out milk, and want to busy themselves with it, and they learn about that individual that he, too, is concerned with the subject matter, not as an object, but as his own affair. On the other hand, if what is supposed to be essential is merely the doing of it, the employment of powers and capacities, or the expression of this particular individuality, then equally it is learned by all parties that they all regard themselves as affected and invited to participate, and instead of a mere doing or separate action, peculiar to the individual who opened up the subject matter, something has been opened up that is for others as well, or is a subject matter on its own account. In both cases the same thing happens and only has a different significance by contrast with what was assumed and was supposed to be accepted. Consciousness experiences both sides as equally essential moments, and in doing so learns what the nature of the matter in hand really is, viz. That it is neither merely something which stands opposed to action in general, and to individual action, nor action which stands opposed to a continuing being and which would be the free genus of these moments as its species. Rather is its nature such that its being is the action of the single individual and of all individuals and whose action is immediately for others, or is a matter in hand and is such only as the action of each and of every one, the essence which is the essence of all being, viz. Spiritual essence. 251 to 252. Es ist also ebenso betrug seine Selbst und der anderen, wenn es nur die reine Sache zu tun sein soll, ein Berufen sein, das ein Sache oft hat, macht weil mir die Erfahrung, dafür die anderen, wie die Fleigen zu frisch aufgestellte Milch, herbe eilen sich die geschafftig wissen wollen, sie neim, dafür es einem ebenso nicht die Sache als Gegenstand, sondern als die Seine zu tun ist. Hingegen, wenn nur das Tun selbst, der Gebrauch der Kraft und Fähigkeiten oder das Aussprechen dieser Individualist das wesentlich sein soll, so wird ebenso gegenseitig die Erfahrung gemacht, dafür als Sekretärin und Verangeligen halten und statt eins reinen Tons oder eins einzeln Eigentümer like in Tons weil mir etwas, das ebenso auch für andere ist, oder ein Sache selbst aufgetan wird. Es gestehut in beiden Fällen dasselbe und hat nur einen wirtschaftlichen Schingegen den Genigen, der dabei angenommen wird und gelten sollt. Das Berufen seiner Verarbeitung als gleichschlussendlich Moment und Heiring was die Nature der Sache selbst ist, non-liquid in der Sache, welch die Tan Behauptung die einzeln in Tan, noch Tan, welch die bestehen in gegengesetzt und die von diesen Momenten als eine Arten Gattung wäre, sondern einwissen, diesen sein das Tan des einzelnen Individuums und aller Individuen, und diesen Tan anmittel bei andere oder ein Sache ist und nur Sache ist als Tan aller und jeder, das Wissen. Welch das Wissen aller Wissen, das geistige Wissen ist. 309 to 310. This unexpected revelation of the collective within individuality and its work will now lead us to two distinct yet fundamental lines of Hegel's thought. The first is, of course, spirit itself, in whose structure other people, and the universal they define, are constitutive, yet now in an historical way rather than a structural one, giving rise to that series of shapes as which we glimpse Hegel's so-called philosophy of history. The other direction in which the ethos of work and externalization takes us can be said to be metaphysical rather than historical, in the sense in which it registers what seem to be philosophical isms and world views, rather than conjunctures and situations. What is at stake here is the Hegelian conception of immanence, a philosophical commitment that may run deeper than the celebration of an ethic of work and externalization, to which it must however be intimately related, and which will, particularly on the political level, be of great significance in the debate by subsequent generations about the revolutionary or reactionary implications of Hegel's work. But that debate needs to be prefaced by a different kind of qualification, namely that, despite his familiarity with Adam Smith and emergent economic doctrine 27, Hegel's conception of work and labor, I have specifically characterized it as a handicraft ideology, betrays no anticipation of the originalities of industrial production or the factory system. And even though one influential strand of the Marxist tradition valorizes work satisfaction and attempts to ideologize a positive and workerist conception of collective labor, it cannot be said that Hegel's analyses of individual work and production here are easily transferred to the new industrial situation. Marx's concept of the fourfold nature of what he calls alienation 28 cannot be extrapolated from Hegel, although with an intensified dose of negativity it is possible to see the dialectic of Sartre's critique as a more radical development of Hegelian ideas of externalization and internalization, applied to history itself.